Hello and welcome everyone to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, Rules as Written, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Join us as we dive deep into games you know or may never have heard of. I am your host, Max, and joining me, of course, is my co-host, Troy. And working behind the scenes to make everything sound nice and wonderful is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is it's very special to me personally because this game, both of these games, not exclusively, but in a major way, opened my eyes to how rules affect the feeling and play of a game that other things that I had played earlier, Dungeons and Dragons, it was really different. And that game, of course, is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd and 4th edition. Yeah, I know, we're doing both because, well, we'll get into the reasons why. So we're going to look at what each does well, what each doesn't do so well, and how best to make use of this game and setting, I suppose. You have run both editions.
That's right. I've run both the 2nd edition a long time ago and more recently the 4th edition of the WFRP, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And you're given a very sort of synchronous set of systems here. They allow you to tell the same types of stories with similar executions and mechanics and details. However, there are some things that separate them, and there are some important distinctions that may draw you to one or the other, but both are grim, they're both perilous, and they're both adventurous in a good regard. So no matter which one you pick, or which one you choose to loot ideas from for the other, per se, you won't be disappointed. I ran 2 adventures in the 1st edition. Sorry, not 1st edition, in 2nd edition. And that would have been, one was set in a town of my own invention in Reichland. And it was like getting involved in organized crime in a slapstick way. While the other one was refugees from the storm of chaos trying to escape beastmen. So that was a very different flavor. And all of it was within the same system and produced pretty short campaigns as we were running them in the middle of many other things and going on in life. But I still have really strong memories of them.
And for my part, I have played in both of them and I've run 4th enough that I know how it works and comparatively how it works to 2nd edition from like a feel point of view. Obviously, to prepare for this episode, I went through both of them and I was like going, it's like the SpongeBob meme with your eyes like going in either direction. Okay, so let's start off where these things come from. Being 2nd edition, obviously there is a 1st edition. And in fact, we have an episode about that. And just to speak back to that episode, I remember enjoy reading that book way more than I thought I was going to.
It's so interesting. Yeah.
It's so quirky and textured the way that old GW stuff is that there's no real comparison to it except through those materials. There's such a vibe there that is the product of all the people involved at that time.
And it's the origin of so many things that we take as Warhammer. They come from this RP, not from the tabletop game per se, right?
Yeah, or they start here and then they begin to elaborate back. It's almost as though, well, there are more editions of the Fantasy Battles game, obviously, but there is this sort of odd, sparse conversation that's happening between the two products at the couple times that it reemerges, and its supplements and the myriad of companies that have been responsible for putting it together, still making it rich and consistent. This is one of those things about Warhammer Fantasy particularly. This is sort of true of 40K, but the way that whoever is working on it, at least up until a certain point, we won't talk about end times, but up to the bulk of it, is so consistent between creators and all. Like, this adds a level of richness, and it's also quirky and weird that, like, even when I looked at it for the first time, I thought, that's dumb. It looks weird. And then when I started digging into it past the surface of the silliness or the appeared silliness, I realized it was really deep and really interesting and weirdly well thought out.
Yes.
Even if it was by a strange game of telephone, it made it make sense as it developed. So Second edition is actually one of the first things that the Black Industries division of Games Workshop put out. The rules design were kind of the brainchild of Green Ronin Press, which is a famous RPG spin-off company, mainly associated with D&D as its origin, I believe, but very quickly diversifying into making a whole bunch of stuff.
They've had stuff like A Song of Ice and Fire. They've had, obviously, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. They have Dragon Age. So there's been quite a number of fantasy settings they've done.
Yeah, they're a very solid development studio that mainly works with other people's IPs.
Yeah.
Historically, they've done good work. I haven't really looked at much of what they've been doing lately, but I have no reason to think they're doing terribly. So yeah, it's obviously built on the foundations of first edition, though it has an extreme streamlining of what happens in that game. First edition could be best described as a very amusing mashup between RuneQuest and D&D.
Yeah, for sure.
With a bunch of other stuff kind of thrown in there, like Call of Cthulhu. It has a couple little things from that.
Yeah, they try and wedge in some cosmic horror there at the top.
Even like the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, it's also quite eclectic in what it's taking from other things.
Totally.
The next sort of ownership of this is that it very quickly goes, because for some reason GW loses interest in maintaining it, and I think something actually happens to Black Industries at this point, but then it immediately goes into the hands of Hogshead Publishing, which is like another RPG studio.
Classic.
And they become responsible for, well, they were responsible for the first edition's expansion, and then they become defunct, and then their modules end up with Green Ronin, and then they begin to kind of piece together first edition into this new version that has, we'll say it's more succinct and a little easier to follow. It also actually has a magic system, unlike what first edition had. Hogshead is more associated with first edition, so I just want to make that clear. It released around the development of 6th edition of Battles, and so it is steeped in that tone shift that 6th edition is famous for, it becoming a bleaker, more grimdark setting, with its tone taking from what they've been doing in 3rd edition Warhammer 40k. And again, other products like Mordheim and Necromunda and all these other things, there's the peak of grimdark is more or less around the end of the 90s and early 2000s. And so the game comes out in 2005, just to peek onto that. Now, 4th edition, I don't know that I was ever expecting it to come out of wherever it came out of, but it came out of Cubicle 7, which, if I believe, is an Irish company.
That's right.
And I don't know that everybody was like, what's going to happen with this? This game has been obviously beloved and it's been dormant for a long time. So much so that 3rd edition, which we haven't talked about, and I'm sure we will, was such a departure from the mechanics that nobody knew what 4th was going to be.
Yeah, 100%.
And 3rd edition was such a
controversy, let's be honest.
Yeah, it was a flat out controversy, so much that it inspired generic revamps of 2nd edition known as Zweihander.
Yep, exactly.
It's like someone took all of 2nd edition and then filed the serial numbers off and sort of streamlined the content of it. I believe more recent editions of it are more, they have like something like a setting in it.
Yes, there are other iterations of the same basic rules concepts into new settings. But that original Zweihander had some cool notions around maybe even using it as like an alt historical engine, you know, like or employing it in these kind of clever fringe cases. But when it came to delivering on the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, for lack of a better term, fantasy, there is nothing that hits it quite like what 2nd had established. 3rd was really cool for some things that it did, but again, was such a radical departure and such a tone shift that it really didn't align with the setting or the player base or the player's expectations. It was kind of like they were trying to invent a new customer to sell this cool idea they had thought up on their own, you know what I mean? And it turns out that customer didn't really exist outside of like a couple of us. You know, I got into that edition a little bit, and then I sold it off to someone who was more interested in it than me. But what came after was really interesting because it was a return to the grittier tone of the first edition, but it was built on the second edition as the backbone, the foundation.
So it was kind of a back to basics set, but it then further streamlined, and not necessarily in a bad way, though in some cases I do take issue with how it's overextending accessibility for tone. But generally speaking, the change in the core system is kind of phenomenal. That's essentially the crux of everything that I was getting out of reading between these two books. So to give a sense about where that's coming from, I will explain the path of the core mechanic of all three of those editions, first, second, and fourth. Third uses the Picto dice system that doesn't fit any of these and would be one of the early iterations of what would become Genesis later.
Exactly.
Between those three editions, there is this interesting progress. So mechanically speaking, first edition feels like someone took RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu, and D&D and kind of mashed them together. And so it uses D100 percentile dice as its main primary dice. And then it uses a bunch of polyhedrals in the way that D&D would. So, different weapons use different combinations of D4s, 6s, 8s. They don't have 10s at that point. So then it immediately goes to 12s. Or if you are using a D10, you're using a D20 that's doubled, like we were mentioning in our first edition Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the system. Then second edition takes that idea and it streamlines it by saying, we're only going to use D10s. You're going to roll 2d10 to determine success with a skill, and then you're going to roll another d10 plus or minus based on whatever the weapon is to determine things like damage and wounds. And then fourth edition's commentary on that is to say, whoa, we're going to go one step further than just using d10s. We're going to use only one roll, which was amazing to me. Like the level of logical efficiency of that and the way they explain it is amazing. This is my favorite part of this game was like, I have long since moved past the novelty of multi-polyhedral dice, and I hate having to tell people what to roll.
Right. Like, no. Sorry, it's the green one with the triangle.
Especially with new players. The great thing about this system is it uses a success level system, which also has an interesting added benefit to its mechanics. So what you do, I love this so much as a designer. I mean, games for every season, of course. Let me gush a little. You make a D100 roll. You have a target number. So this is your characteristic stat plus any skill plus or minus any modifiers. And the nice thing about doing it that way, this is true of many of the editions, is it leaves that number open on the table so that the person rolls it and it's not like a hidden thing. Like I still make hidden rolls, but that upfront, you're fighting chance, not me as the GM, is very apparent.
Yep.
And that is my preferred way to go. I only make a secret roll if it's something that like informs me as to what the player knows when they don't know something for drama. Then what you do is that target number is broken into obviously a tens digit and a ones digit. And for every number the tens digit on the die is over the target number, you get one level of success. So if you were trying to beat 56 and you rolled a 42, then you would get, I guess that's 2 levels of success. No, 1 level of success. Sorry. 1 level of success.
Because you got to clear it, right?
Yeah, you have to clear it. And also, if you roll within that number, you get 0 levels of success. So if you roll within the 50 range, you still pass, but you don't get any additional bonus to that. And there's some really cool, like, you just succeed, or maybe you succeed and fail. Like, it gets that notion that other systems can do where, you pick the lock, but you break it, right? And so now everybody's going to know that the lock is picked because now it's like on the floor or it's got the picks tangled into it.
Exactly.
Fun stuff like that.
Gradiated success is just like right into every roll. It's awesome.
But it's better than gradiated success because it's gradiated success. And this is true of any system that does this for the most part, but like the simplicity of the fact that it's a numerical value that's easy to understand. So it's not an interpreted like, oh, you got so many boons on your roll, and I have to figure out what that means. No, there's a straightforward, clear number that is based on how good you are in that moment at that thing. If your margin for success is narrow, then your levels of success will be lesser. It telescopes not only the challenge of it, but also the quality, and it feels good. But, and this is true of previous editions, but is always a fun thing to bring up, there is target location in almost every edition of the game. I'm pretty sure every edition. I'm not sure about third. In order to do that, you just reverse the numbers. So you read the ones as the tens and the tens as the ones. And it creates this very nice, easy dynamic. There are a few times where you do re-roll it, like if you get a natural critical, which happens on a doubles on any of the dice, at least in 4th edition. I think a critical in 2nd edition is just rolling in a really, really narrow percentile, like within 5 or 10%.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And it's fairly straightforward. I think it just bypasses, like you just get a crazy critical.
Yeah, like no armor, just wreck them.
Yeah, which is always dramatic. And this essentially does a similar thing. It's just that when you get a doubles, so if you get and it has to be a doubles that passes the difficulty. So the number that you're testing. So if you get, and it's a roll under system. I don't know. I took that for granted to the fact that it was percentile, but I'll say that. So yeah, if you're trying to get that 56 and you got a 44, you get a critical. If you get an 88, you get a critical miss.
I love those. I love a game that's not afraid to have a critical miss, like a bad fail state, not just like oh, you didn't quite get it. It's like, no, you're going to pay for it. And not that you're going to take the player's favorite weapon and throw it off a bridge, but maybe you will do that because, come on, sometimes that is the drama.
Yeah. And the best thing about this is this one roll can tell you 3 things about combat, which is just makes combat so much more smooth and streamlined. And plus, you don't have to roll and then re-roll one of the dice and be like, wait, what was the first roll again? Should that ever come up? And it's like, nope. You just leave your roll on the table and everyone can analyze it and see how you did based on the number you were rolling against. It even makes having to change things on the fly, like someone screwed something up, and you can quickly turn it into a success because I forgot to add this bonus or whatever. So the difficulty number goes down and you might then cross the die you just rolled. I don't mind doing that. So long as no one has re-rolled the die, it's kind of like chess moves, right? If you let go of the piece, if you re-roll it, then that's gone.
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
The way I run it at my table is as long as those dice are there and we're still deliberating what you're doing, you can adjust that if you forgot something.
I do like when there is a consequence to committing to action, but you get to state your commitment. But once you have, that's happening. I don't like the idea that you can like accidentally trigger like, oh no, I did that by accident, but I do want there to be a moment as a game master where you can draw that line and this is the point of no return on this action. And we go to the next action, which could be correcting what you just did wrong, or maybe exploiting something that went right.
This leads us into character progression. And another aspect that I found was really interesting between the two systems. One that doesn't look too favorably on 2nd edition so much as the way 4th does it, though I have seen complaints to the contrary, but I will make my case. So it has to do with advancement in the game. Troy, do you want to explain how the careers system works?
In general, you do not have a class. There are careers. The careers come from broad families, which are labeled classes in 4th ed, as a hark back to 1st edition. But what this is it's a profession in the world. It's not some title that we as the game setting are using, but no one in the game world itself uses, like fighter, for example, from other role-playing games. It's like you are a guy called a protagonist. And I choose that on purpose because it's not a protagonist in the narrative sense of being the key member of a story, but it's the old, like traditional old European usage in sort of more like 16th, 17th century capacity, where you're kind of just like a bruiser.
Professional bully, essentially.
Exactly. You go out and you go make money by collecting debts for organized crime, hustling people for shakedowns, doing protection rackets yourself. Like, you're a grimy character, and you're not just playing a rogue. you're playing this specific person. And you may have a fence who's in your party, another profession that has different skills, different progressions, and different things that they can do. And I used progression there, importantly, because the career systems start in like a basic career, but you can advance to these other career outcomes that can be anything from a marginal twist on what you can already do to like, wow, that is unlocking some crazy potential. And you get there by spending XP, of course, that we're all familiar with, but you have to also acquire the trappings of the trade.
Yeah, that's almost more of a second edition-ism. It is sort of suggested in fourth, but that's something that I absolutely do at my table. In fact, changing careers is a pretty dramatic thing. And one of the things that I like about this system is it's ostensibly a skill-based system, say like Call of Cthulhu, but it's using the framework of a class. So when you're in a class, in a career within a class, it gives you access to a list of skills for which you can buy points individually toward. And also talents, which are effectively like feats would be in D&D 3rd edition onward. And the idea is that you can keep working within that career, getting those skills. But if you want to diversify that, you either have to move up in the career, which in 4th edition is essentially internal to that career's progression, or in 2nd edition, it's a different career that uses a system of entries and exits. So yeah, a good example of this is if you were a squire, your exit would be to the knight class, which I think is an advanced class in 2nd.
Yeah.
And then in 4th edition, it's more like 4 tiers within that ability. So you start off as the squire, and then if you keep progressing, if you complete the squire's ability, you then move into the next tier, or can move into the next tier. I like the willing buy-in. In fact, you can even go backward into classes in some cases if it makes narrative sense.
Yes, 100% narrative rules all.
But I like the idea that it's just this narrow fix of skills that you can pick, and you keep your skills no matter what happens if you change classes, which means your character becomes really textured as they move. So like maybe you start off as a squire, but then you're forced into a life of thievery, but you still have all your squire skills. So it's more like a progression system than it is like a class.
Yes.
It's like a menu of abilities. And there's different advantages. I find more tonal advantages to the 2nd edition approach because it allows for a wider sprawling range of both basic and advanced classes.
My example is, okay, in 4th you're a squire, so you're going to become a knight unless the narrative grounds change that you would make a career change, right? In 2nd edition, when you reach the point that you may have an outcome where you can progress out of squire, you don't have to go to knight. You could go to mercenary. Like you could completely you could forget the colors and like, no, I'm going to make money on my own now with my sword arm. And you can kind of go your own way. And of course, 4th edition will still enable you to do that. But 2nd has that just that much easier to do, that very cool and organic character shift that, again, is not meant to like lock you into now here's the 4 core abilities you have in this class. It's more, here's the new, as Max said, buffet of abilities you can enjoy and pick from as you continue your progression.
Yeah, and I find both systems work fine, though there is something that I'll get into later about something that both systems do well, but I think 2nd does a lot better. But anyway, so you get these skills, and then you get this progression of abilities where you basically use experience points to buy skills, which get more expensive as you progress. In the case of 2nd edition, these are allotted in 5% chunks for the most part. And in 4th edition are more based on this sort of tiered menu where you can buy into certain abilities at certain times. And then as you move up in ranks, those characteristic improvements expand the number of characteristics you have or that you can upgrade. And they also become relatively harder based on how high they currently are. Now, some people complain about how that makes character progression slower, and I would agree, and I think it's a good thing. One of the tonal issues I have with second edition is that characters get too good too fast, and they feel, despite how perilous and dangerous the game is, the characters run the risk of turning into Gotrek and Felix, like, almost by accident, and way too fast. I really feel the meat of the game is playing ordinary people that very gradually turn into heroes. Like, that spectrum of change works better. And a huge improvement in incentives when it comes to this style of progression is that people stop thinking about getting better at their character and they play the game.
Yes, it's not just a point accumulation system.
Yeah, this is one of my personal pet peeves about the way games are designed. I hate power creep. Or no, I don't hate power creep. It's fine, because if you're playing a supers game, that's all right. But I don't like it when the focus of the game is the internal improvement of the characters, because it makes it all about you getting better and not you exploring or finding new things in the world, right? I much prefer you to find an enchanted magic sword than focus on getting the same abilities that your character, like, I don't know, divine slash from your paladin or whatever, that would make your current sword more unique. Because then it just becomes this game of making the character better, and it drives the attention away from the world in a subtle level, right? Like, I don't think that it's a huge thing, but I think at higher levels, it really turns into a bit of a grind. And the nice thing about scaling everything back and making it so granular is that it really, you think hard about what you want to improve based on how your character is doing, but the improvements are so subtle that you don't focus on them. And again, that's just my personal take. There are some people out there who much prefer like a heavy power game where you're constantly getting abilities and stuff like that. But I think Warhammer 4th and even 2nd do a decent job of, I think 4th does a better job of making this slower, but it feels more like you're gradually improving. And so you're focused more on the mystery of the game. Combat in both games is insanely deadly.
Oh, it really is. It's like the threat threshold is something that will require your players to be informed of if they're used to the balancing of other fantasy games. Like, you have to give a heads up if someone's coming over from something a little bit more sword and shield. You know what I mean?
Yeah, something a bit more like a heroic fantasy game as opposed to a grimdark game. I've heard people jokingly refer to it as D&D meets Call of Cthulhu, in the way that the adventures are more about investigation and plot intrigue and less about killing monsters. Like, it has more of the... It's slightly more combat focused than Call of Cthulhu, where you want to avoid combat at all costs. But in Wolf Rap, you want to engage in combat with normal people for the most part, or smaller level minions. And if you find something like a chaos spawn, you're going to run.
You're going to get out of there. Like, what I like about it is that there are no trash mobs at all. A guy with a knife in a pub is as dangerous as anything to your life if you're not prepared for it. I mean, if you've got like your plate on and you're looking him in the eyes, you beat him up. But I mean, like a guy who's paid a couple shillings to get revenge on you, you know, they can do it with just a butcher's knife. And that level of visceral reality to the violence makes it so much more interesting than this game where you're like, I just got smoked in the face with what is a mace and I'm good. I just got like a little cut above my eye. It's like, what are you talking about?
I have so many hit points, I can just shrug off that hit. Yeah, hit point progression in this does exist. They're called wounds. A weird holdover because you lose wounds. That's one of those things about the system. It's just one of those old quirks where I'm like, shouldn't you be gaining wounds?
Yes, exactly.
I can live with that. It's just a semantic issue. There's more of that idea that, like, even getting into a bar fight, you could walk away with some serious injuries. Like, nothing, probably not lethal, but like if you then go adventuring after your bar fight, you're like, oh man, I got a cracked rib. And it actually, that specific injury will give you specific penalties, which is by far my favorite thing about the game, is the critical wounds in whatever edition.
It's so good.
And that's what most people know the game for. And yeah, there's tables like that you can get for D&D, but like anybody who understands RPG design or just game design generally is that the more you tailor around your mechanics having a particular feel rather than just tacking on a mechanic, is that it's going to feel more integral to that experience. A little bit of a tangent, but what we were talking about reminded me of this fact. Another thing that I find that 4th edition does better than 2nd, and this has to do with the progression aspect, is that there seems to have been a conscious effort to justify the use of a percentile die in all cases.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're generating your core stats, you roll 2d10 and you add them together. This is true for both games. And then you usually add another number to that, like 20 or 10 or whatever, depending nominally on what race you're playing. From that point on, all other progression is essentially in chunks of 10 or 5. It doesn't unjustify the use of the D100 because you do end up with these odd values from the initial characteristic roll, but it's a hair's breadth away from justifying using a D20. It almost doesn't really make enough of a point to do that. But then I look at 4th edition in how you buy skills in like individual little pieces and how they become more expensive as you buy them. And there's literally, you use like 5 points of experience to buy 1 more point in a skill. So not only does that slow down the progress and make the game a bit grittier, but it also means that you're only improving things at 1 point at a time, which means that your characters, you're going to end up with more odd numbers that aren't divisible by 5. And anybody who knows, any numbers that are divisible by 5 probably are more efficiently rolled on a D20. Because then why are you using such granularity if you only need to know what every 5% actually is?
That's so true.
So that was just one of those things where I was like looking at the math and I was looking at the design and being like, wow, there's a lot of mechanics in 4th edition that really want you to roll single digit granularities. Like there's things that are in big chunks, like 10s, like for instance, the general difficulty that's applied to your characteristic and skills. So hard, I think, is it's -10, and then it goes to -20 and -40, and then there's positive improvements if it's easier. You know, again, it's a normal difficulty scale for a lot of games. This is what would change your DC level in D&D.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a subtle thing, but I just appreciate that they acknowledge that there needs to be a good reason why you're using this die. And having those gradual improvements makes it feel a little bit more, granular, I guess, which again goes to the progress and all this other stuff. And I feel it's a good game you can play for quite a while.
You don't hit the ceiling anytime soon. And with each career having 4 tiers, the lethality of a character also being considered, you're not likely to max out a character on your first try with them anyways. You know, you're very likely to have to say goodbye to a few player characters before you really get a 4th level character, or 4th tier, pardon me. There's a way, like, I don't mean this in a negative way, but there's a certain familiarity required with the game to really start to excel at it, because it's going to punish you. Not in a way that's unjust or ruthless, but a little bit, because the combat can, if you're not smart about starting or ending a combat, it can get you.
Yeah, you could get into, and you'll be doing this to opponents just as well as they'll be doing it to you. But yeah, you can get smoked pretty hard. And most of the encounters that I've seen play out was because the players didn't take full advantage of their own circumstance. So like, you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to challenge these guys to a fight in the street. I'm like, no, because if you want to win that fight, you're just going to jump them.
Yeah.
Right. You want because there's a good chance with all the benefits of having first strike on them that you take them out in the first round, or that subsequent rounds, or at least they're so beaten and ruined, they're either running away or easy to finish off. So it very much is this idea that you want to play dirty. You want to take every advantage, because if you go into a straight up fight, it could get really nasty.
Playing dirty is such a good way to describe the player character mentality of this game. Because like this is 1st edition, so it is not exactly in line with our conversation here today, but as a scene setter in first edition, you're literally in like one of the starter scenarios. You're wading through sewage up to your knees, tracking a thief. And it's just like, yeah, you're going to get in the muck, and it's going to be a lot grittier and dirtier than you may expect from some high fantasy settings. I wouldn't call this high fantasy, but
It's not. It really isn't.
But it has things that you might mistake, right? It has elves, it has wizardry, it has some things that are almost the trappings. But as soon as you get into this and you start to recognize like how messy it can get, like one of the examples I played in a game of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was we got ambushed by beastmen trying to cross a river, and one of our party members drowned. Like, they didn't get killed by the beastmen, they fell in the water and drowned. And it was iconic for that alone.
Yeah, there are rules in this game for catching a cold. They're not core rules, but those rules exist, and they're part of like the weather and travel. And it's just like, oh man, like that sounds like it sucks. But if you're the sort of person that understands that the challenge of the thing adds to the fun of playing it, you're going to love the idea that could happen.
Yeah, 100%.
This also kind of brings me into another major theme of the game that I really appreciate, and I kind of alluded to earlier, which is, well, I hadn't brought it up, but like it's one of those things that I think second edition does a bit of a better job at than fourth, which is the feel of the game and its rules as it pertains to the way that it plays.
Okay.
That sounds weird and obscure, and I'm not even sure I said anything that made sense when I said that, but let me put it like this. D&D feels like a list of classes and rules that are then applied to a setting. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay feels like a setting that was then translated into rules. This distinction is so important in the difference about how these games feel that it might not seem obvious until you get into it and you're kind of like wondering why this feels different. But there are things in that approach that create weird asymmetries and quirks that make the world feel more visceral. Like one of my favorite examples of this, and this is more pronounced in second edition, but it is mentioned in fourth, is the Slayer class. So for those that don't know, Slayers are a dwarf-only occupation. I don't even know if that's a good way to put it, where a dwarf has shamed themselves and have then taken an oath of repentance, effectively, to die in battle. The fun part about the tension of that in the lore is that they can't just let themselves be killed. They have to actually try their hardest to fight so that they can die gloriously. It's sort of like a cross between samurai and Viking thought process. But it's also pretty unique in some of that tension. But if you look at the Slayer class in the game, it basically says that once you enter it, you can't leave. Yeah, when you enter the Slayer career, that's you until you're dead, in which case that is the objective of what you're doing as your character.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's this thing about like, I'm not just playing a wizard, or I'm not just playing a fighter. I'm playing a culturally specific career or individual that has these, like the lore interweaves with the rules in a way that they can't be separated. Another really good example of this is how wizards work. So something about how the setting of the Empire in particular, but this is more or less true of all human nations, is magic is scary and weird, and it's generally tied to chaos, which is dangerous. And wizards exist, but they are basically an exemption that was developed during a particular historical event involving particular historical people. And if you are playing a wizard in Warhammer Fantasy, if you're playing it authentically to the lore, you are effectively a very, very powerful indentured slave.
Well, you're like royal property, right?
Yeah, you are. You're owned by the state, effectively. And more than that, you can only be sanctioned from the College of Magic in Altdorf. So this pertains that if you start as a wizard, that's where you come from. I mean, you probably came from somewhere else, but your career didn't start until you actually got to this one specific city in the world and started studying. Now, you could extend this to the fact that there are court wizards which are basically sanctioned wizards that go to work for different noble provinces and royal families for an elector count or something even less than that. Though you are fantastically unique, incredibly untrusted by society, and really powerful. And the way that magic works in this world is there's this constant threat of losing control and being destroyed by it. So if you're playing a wizard in this game, you're not just, I've got so many spell slots and I can make up like whatever justification because magic is ubiquitous in, say, Forgotten Realms in a way that I argue makes not that much sense.
Right.
But because the way that setting's written, it doesn't have to, or it sets itself up as such. Again, if you're playing a wizard in Warhammer Fantasy, you're playing a very specific person that is not like any other character, like player character at that table. Unless, of course, there's another wizard. Same true if you're playing a witch. So a witch is somebody who's essentially a freelance self-taught magician who is essentially a walking time bomb of chaos. And they don't know it in a lot of cases, or if they do know it, they don't care. There's the tension of that. There's also the fact that there's a career which is called witch hunter, and your specific job is to hunt down witches. So if you have a witch and a witch hunter in the same party, one of those characters is going to be the tension in that moment is them hiding who they are from this person that actively wants to kill and burn them. That sounds messy and asymmetrical, and that's why it's wonderful. That's the thing that makes, because I've often said on this show, in terms of RPGs, but in some cases, a lot of games, balance is an oversold virtue.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially in RPGs. Because what you're doing is you're doing this to tell a story with a nice fixed structure to make sure that it doesn't bias any one person, right? That's the job of the rules, is to actually take control away from everybody to some extent by having everyone held to the same standard. Having the rules develop out of the setting without any regard to how the parody of these things to each other makes that world feel more real. Hands down. Like I'm sure someone will try to prove to me that that's not the case, but from my experience, that's basically how it works. There's so many other things to this where like clearly immersion into the world mattered more than accessibility, which is more what I think of Dungeons and Dragons' focus is. So for instance, they use an old British money system. So you have pennies and shillings and pounds. And if you know anything about how those denominations are not based in increments of 10, like gold, silver, and copper pieces, it's harder, certainly. The cool thing about it is that it makes that world feel more authentic, because even though you have to remember that it's 12 pennies to a shilling and 20 shillings to a pound, once you get it, you feel like you're in that world. The calendar works. Same thing with that. They effectively have the same number of months, but not really. And there's a different number of days. And there's the old medieval concept of days that are not within a month. They really embrace like the vibe. Now, I would argue that second edition does a better job of digging into that grim, dark, gritty vibe. Almost too much, actually. In fact, my argument, which I will make toward as we get to the end of this episode, is actually the best version of this game is to take second and fourth and play them as one game. Primarily leaning on the efficiency of fourth edition, but using the supplements of second.
Yeah, to build your setting and world out, for sure.
It feels realistic while still feeling adventurous and a little pulpy. Because I find that fourth edition doesn't express the dark awfulness of the world, but it does create a better ordinary world that is more believable of normal people living in it. The way that I was describing it to Troy was that you want to have fourth edition's sort of interpretation of tone to be the surface, and then as the players dig down, they dig into the second edition, and to some degree the first edition, which is also weird, but all more comical. Yeah, Warhammer is a textured thing, and my whole point is embracing that texture makes the game feel less generic.
So I have a question for you. If I was to throw a curveball at you and ask you if you were to make a character now, In either second or fourth, what's the character you would want to make and play most?
Based on my exploration of the setting more broadly, I'd probably want to play some kind of magic user, because the magic in the game, the system of magic and its sort of philosophical explanations are, I think, one of the secret strong points of the setting.
That's cool.
Yeah, it has to do with this idea of winds of magic and how chaos that bleeds out of a gate in the polar regions is then refracted into like other more safe but weaker forms of magic. And it's just like, just playing a character that wraps their entire head around that is really neat. Probably not the easiest thing to play from the get-go, but as you get more comfortable and more interested in the world, it's really fun. I've been reading through the Gotrek and Felix books, and I've halfway through Giant Slayer, which really gets into the magical aspects of the world and the elves to some extent as well. And yeah, I think I would probably lean into that, or I might play like a witch or a hedgewise or something like that, some folk magic user. What about you? What would you play if you could just make one up from the ground?
See, for me, it would work in either 2 or 4, but I would do someone who is involved in the criminal side of the empire, smuggling, fencing, or larceny, like some of these gritty things that don't really cross over into adventuring, but are like the realm of like pickpockets and cut purses. This game embraces that shady side of life and really gives you an ability to play one of those characters as not just like a walking around town waving to everyone like, "Hi, I'm the local thief." It's like, no, like you are a member of a maybe a secret society, maybe you have a secret language, and like a cant, like a thief's cant, and you will exist in the low brass tiers of society, but that gives you a weird flexibility as well in the lack of responsibilities pinned to you. It's really cool. So I would see myself definitely playing some type of grimy criminal character with an over-the-top accent, right?
Well, one of the nice things about the game is, especially one of the advantages of having the classes back in 4th edition, is that you can actually sort of tailor a list to a particular campaign. So you could literally just take rogues and all of the classes would be picked off of that list. And so you could create a cohesive party around a class. So that could be, thieves, grave robbers, fences, charlatans, and just make a party out of those. And you could, and it's a nice, quick thematic element that also allows all the characters to be something different and unique. And also, again, if you go underneath that, again, they're also individuals that could change careers and classes, even outside of the rogue class of careers. Yeah. So I admire the flexibility of both systems, but I like that there were lessons learned from 2nd that worked their way out in 4th. Now, I've been talking up 4th quite a lot because I quite like it. There are some things about it that might turn people off. One that I almost feel ruins the game to some extent.
I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. So the first and easiest criticism is that 4th edition is insanely technical. I'm being hyperbolic. It's totally manageable, and that core dice system and how it treats things is fun, but it has a tactical combat aspect that uses keywords and abilities that I really like. We've talked about keyword-based systems before. Different weapons work really well because they have distinctive qualities that you can then apply. Basically, it makes the weapon different without it just doing more damage or doing less damage and being faster or whatever like that.
Yeah.
For instance, if you have like a Warhammer, for example, it has a penalty to its defense in parrying. So because it's end heavy, it's not the best weapon to like swing up in a block. It doesn't make it impossible, but a sword is a much better tool. In fact, it's funny, swords are the baseline for the game. They have no keywords attached to them. One-handed swords, I should say.
Yeah.
that makes the game feel really interesting, and it makes it really tactically intense. And if you're into that, that's great. But it's a lot to remember. It's a lot to kind of throw around and try to figure out how all of these things apply. And it might be a game where you want to bring these rules in gradually so that you can internalize certain concepts, as opposed to second edition, which is a lot more straightforward. It's simpler in that way. So if you're looking for that level of detail where you want the war pick and the battle axe to actually feel different, they're not going to feel that different, where fourth makes a really good attempt at that, but then you're eating up bandwidth in your brain and the table as well. So as much, I'm okay with this, but some people prefer a lighter game. And so I totally get that. And I think that's what Zweihander tries to sell itself on, is a less complicated by comparison.
Yeah, I get that.
At least a more recent edition. The other, and this is the bad gripe about 4th edition, its expansions are really cool. However, so these are additional books, the way they've laid out rules, additional rules for the game, is they're all over the place. And they are really hard to consolidate. So, for instance, they describe it as a living system, which is a garbagey term, which means that it's a mess.
That's not wrong. Let's be honest.
I'll give you a couple examples of this problem. So you have your core rule book, and weapons have these distinctive categories. But in order for you to get better fidelity in the weapon detail, so for instance, there's a weapon called hand weapon, which is essentially a catch-all for a one-handed anything, a sword, an axe, a club, doesn't matter. In order to bring more detail and fidelity to those hand weapons, you have to get a book called Up in Arms, which is a great book, and it adds a lot of tactical complexity. It gives an overhaul of the advantage system and makes it a party advantage system. It adds a whole bunch of new careers, especially knights and warriors and camp followers and all this cool stuff. But so that part's straightforward enough. Okay, so we got our core book and we got our combat book. And then we have a book that's dedicated entirely to magic, and it does a wonderful job of explaining the 8 subtypes of wizards, as well as magister vigilance and mundane alchemists and all these other cool things. And it does an amazing job of, better than any magic related book that I've seen in the setting, a very concise and curated explanation of how the winds of magic and chaos actually work. Great. Okay, so we're up to 3 books and they're fairly cohesive. However, if you want river trade rules, which play a big part in the game, you're going to have to buy a supplement to the Enemy Within campaign that focuses around river travel, because that campaign focuses around it. But wait, it gets weirder and more messy. There's a class called Riverfolk, and it has a bunch of things like River Wardens and Stevedores and all this other stuff. But there's a supplement called Sea of Claws, which is the large ocean to the north of the Empire. And it also has a new class called Seafarer, in which the classes within those two overlap, and they have explanations for how to make those things make sense. But then some things are redundant in some cases. Also, if they bring in new careers that are really similar to other careers, like, say, Scryer and Fortune Teller,
right,
there's like a footnote about how you randomly roll to see what initial class you get, but when you get to that point, you just pick between the two of them. And it just makes a pig's ear out of the entire menu of rules, character options, equipment, adventures, by scattering it all over the place and making it really hard to find. Like, they just released a couple of dwarf-centric rule books. One of them is a player's guide, and one of them is a GM's guide, and I don't understand why these weren't just a book for dwarves, because there was nothing particularly in the dwarf's GM guide that didn't feel like it couldn't have been part of the other one.
Right.
This problem happened to 3rd edition D&D, partly because of the OGL and its explosion, but there was too many books with too many rules in too many places. And it seems that the designers for this edition disregarded the lesson there and have gone totally mad. I have no other way of explaining it beyond that. they put things in places that I would never think to look. At least the thing I could say about 3rd edition is that, I have to remember that the spell sword class for the fighter wizard combination is in this particular magic using book, and it's labeled as such. But no, some of these are like supplements for adventures, or they're in the adventure themselves, or they're part of something that contains a smorgasbord of different stuff that is sort of related under a theme, but then you have to remember that one, like the travel rules, are in a book about thieves or about rogues and rangers, which makes sense because of rangers. But then there's also massive descriptions of the cult of Randall, which is like the thief god.
Yes, and those being adjacent makes less sense.
Well, I mean, they do, but they don't have to pack them. Like, I suppose there's any way that you can put these things together, but my big detraction of the system is that it's kind of messy. Actually, it's really messy. And I've had to make my own lookup guide, which when I feel it's in a state where other people could use it, maybe I'll put it up somewhere so that people can download it and hopefully it's helpful. But for instance, the core book has only Reichlanders as humans, but then other books from other provinces introduce other origin points, and they have their own skill lists. And it's like, well, but if I wanted to roll a character, I don't want to have to jump through 6 books in order to figure out what each person is playing. So anyway, that's my rant of the frustrating thing. And I have been dedicated enough to this system to at least have a PDF copy of every book that's come out. So I feel like I've got a good landscape of this. And it's if you were committed enough to be someone who wants to run this, you don't need all of these rules. But if you feel like you want to get a lot of options, you're going to have to remember where it's all at. But I still recommend it. And I still recommend 2nd edition. It's a different vibe, both tone and rules, but it's eminently playable. And I don't know if we need to review Zweihander because of how similar they are, but maybe we will anyway, if enough people are interested in that.
But we'll probably revisit ideas around this again, maybe in a Tales of Lore or in a follow-up episode about this, because there really is so much to dive in on when it comes to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It is both a great exercise in design and design evolution, but the setting itself is just sharp and detailed and full of such interesting nuance.
Yeah, I do feel that we're going to have to get into a lore. Like, we didn't talk really, I mean, we talked a little bit about the lore, but only as it intersected with the rules. But I really feel that, we need a Tales of Lore that's just dedicated to getting into this setting, and probably in some weird, minute detail. I know there's a whole bunch of Warhammer lore channels, but like, I don't feel they dig into some of like the philosophical and metaphysical implications of some of the ideas presented therein. They're just regurgitating like the events that happen in the world in a cohesive way, which is great. I've learned a lot about things from listening to those podcasts and those channels.
Yep.
But I want to have a discussion about how things work in that world.
Yeah.
Because it's really interesting, not only how it works, but how I think it came about to work that way. I won't get into anything because I'm just going to pad out the time. But I think this game is great. All of its systems, they all have their advantages. I still don't know 3rd, so don't include that one in that comment. But I think it's miles above Dungeons & Dragons, which I know is a controversial thing to say, but it's a more mature game for a more mature player. And I don't mean mature in the sense that like you have to be an adult to play it, though you probably should. But more mature in the sense that you've played D&D, you've played a bunch of other games, and now you're craving that like that visceral complexity that those games might claim to offer, but I feel that these games actually do. You know what? Screw it. The next episode is going to be that Warhammer Fantasy conversation.
I'm excited for it. Let's just do it. Let's just leap to it. Why would we wait?
You know what? I kind of had something else planned, but we're already in the mood. We're already talking about it.
I'm loving it.
So we're going to dig into the lore half of this, and it's basically going to be a part 2.
Be a companion episode for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, until you hear us again, thank you for listening. Also, thank you so much to everybody who got excited. There was a lot of excitement around our DIY episode, and we've already received some people sending us stuff, and I'm super pumped to just dig into these games and give what I hope are valued critiques and show off things to people that other people have made. You know, you could be sitting on gold and not know it. And as I said before, it doesn't have to be a full game. It can be your module for a D&D adventure or whatever RPG.
Absolutely.
And it could be your house rules for a war game. It does have to be something that we can actually look at and paw through, and we will play it and we will assess its quality therein on that basis. So thank you, everybody who's if not given us something, then at least shown interest in giving us something.
That's great. We're so excited by that. And we look forward to looking at the content that comes our way, finding new old titles, and looking at some of the new things. We really look at some of the most recent Too Fat Lardy releases as well in some upcoming episodes. So we've got a few things we really want to get out to everyone. So I'm excited. I think we have a good moment here in gaming when there's a lot of cool action happening. So we'll be here to capture that.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of things on the horizon. The whole field has been abuzz with many new things, as it sometimes is.
Yes, indeed.
Until then, have a great one and happy gaming.
Happy gaming, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.